Welcome to Unit 4, the first area of study learning. Just a reminder with these videos that you should definitely watch them twice. Once to write the notes down, and maybe you want to watch it without volume. That's really up to you. And then a second time where you can actually sit back and just really listen to what I'm saying and concentrate on the video. Okay, so let's get into it. So this is learning. Before we get into learning, there's a couple of things we need to do, and we need to talk about 3 different behaviours that are not learnt behaviours. So these are behaviours that are pre-programmed and require no learning. These are reflex actions, fixed action patterns, and behaviours due to maturation. So most of you know what reflexes are, but ensure that you've actually got that definition there. So it's an automatic involuntary action that does not require prior experience, and they usually aid survival. So examples are blinking, coughing. You still have those reflexes now, but of course you're born with many more reflexes. So things like a sucking reflex, newborns will have. So if you put your finger in a newborn's mouth, they will automatically, without having to learn it, they will automatically suck on your finger. If you brush your hand on their cheek, they will automatically turn their cheek towards your hand. And they're both reflexes geared towards them actually being able to turn their head towards their mother's nipple and then of course suck on their mother's nipple. So as adults we don't have a lot of reflexes, but as newborns we have a lot, and these tend to go after the first couple of years of life. So know the definition and know at least one example of a reflex. Fixed action patterns are also not learnt. So these are inborn predisposition to behave in a certain way in response to stimuli in the environment. The difference with this is every member in a species will display the same behaviour. So if you think about reflex actions, this goes across different species, whereas fixed action patterns tend to be quite species specific. So for instance, a funnel web spider creates a tubular web, whereas another species of spider might actually produce a different type of web. Okay, so fixed action patterns are usually seen in animals, and they might include things like hibernation type behaviour, migration type behaviour, perhaps even some mating rituals as well, and we'll watch some videos on those things in class. We as humans, it's debatable whether we have fixed action patterns, but again we'll chat about this in class. The other third behaviour is behaviours due to maturation. So this means that, for instance, if you take a newborn baby, you can't make them walk. So you can't teach them to walk. They're not capable of learning that yet because their nervous system and their body is not at the appropriate level of development. So some behaviours simply can't be learnt, but we have to wait till our body is able to mature, and then once it is in the right level of maturation, you will be able to display this behaviour. Okay. Moving on, definition of learning. So learning is a lasting change in behaviour, so it's not something that's temporary and displayed one day and not the next. So lasting behavioural knowledge that occurs as a result of experience. You have to have an experience with something for you to learn it. So whether it's been exposed to the knowledge or whether it's been exposed to a certain behaviour and then perhaps a punishment, but there has to be exposure as a result of experience for you to learn something. Okay, we need to get into the brain basics of learning. So let's talk about the brain structures. So there's quite a few different structures. So we've got the hippocampus and the amygdala, which you've learnt about before in memory. And the hippocampus is involved when we learn declarative type information. So anything that's not procedural. So for instance, if someone has damage to the hippocampus, they're able to feel emotions, such as fear if an electric shock was given. The thing is that if you go to give them the electric shock the next time, they won't remember to be fearful the next time. So most of us would know that something gave us an electric shock and next time we'd be quite hesitant. Someone with damage to the hippocampus wouldn't be. The amygdala is very similar to the hippocampus, except it's more talking about the emotions involved in learning. So again, the person who learns to fear an object, they won't have that same fear response if they've had their amygdala are actually damaged. So both the hippocampus and the amygdala are involved in learning in very similar ways. The difference is the amygdala basically allows us to feel the emotion. So if your hippocampus is damaged, you can feel the emotion, you just won't remember to. Whereas if the amygdala is actually damaged, you won't actually have any emotion to an object that should, in most people, show a fear response. The cerebral cortex, so that's of course the top forebrain of the entire brain. So we know that it's got a frontal lobe, a temporal lobe, occipital lobe, and a parietal lobe. And we know that most of these lobes are involved in learning, but particularly the frontal lobe in a particular area called the basal ganglia. You don't actually need to know where that part is. Just remember that the basal ganglia is involved in learning. The cerebellum, which is our little hind brain, is definitely involved when we're learning motor skills or movement sequences. And another area which you haven't heard about before, the ventral tegmental area, which is in our midbrain, is activated when we are rewarded. And we tend to remember the feeling of being rewarded. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in regards to operant conditioning. Okay, so basically when we learn something new, we know that this learning involves the creation of new neural pathways or the strengthening of an existing pathway. So we know that learning happens at a neural level. And when this new pathway is formed, this is called synaptogenesis. During learning, the axon terminals of one neuron, which we call the presynaptic neuron, so the first neuron, releases a neurotransmitter called glutamate. You definitely have to know that glutamate is the name of the transmitter involved in learning. And this glutamate basically allows filigree, which is a little structure, to grow across the synaptic gap, connecting the presynaptic neuron, the axon terminals of the presynaptic neuron, to the dendrites of the postsynaptic neuron. And basically, this learning, or the learning that takes place, is basically the strengthening of that connection that now exists between the neurons. And we know that the more the pathway is activated, the stronger the learning becomes. And again, we'll watch a video about this to really hone it in for you in class. Our brains are very plastic, and you saw a video in the first half of the year where we saw a little girl have half of her brain removed and how she could adapt to that. And this is called plasticity. So it's the way the brain changes in response to the environment. So her new environment was only having half of a brain. But of course we know that there's always new environments to go into, and they don't have to be as drastic as that. We know that plasticity is essential for learning to take place, and we undergo plasticity across the entire lifespan. So in other words, our brains are constantly changing due to the changes in our environment. There's two different types of plasticity that you need to know about. Developmental plasticity, which is the basic development of the nervous system, and this is happening throughout your entire life. But more so in children and adolescents than adults, so it's slowed down by the time you get to my age. Basically, there's 5 stages that your nervous system will go through, so 5 stages to developmental plasticity. The first is called proliferation, and this is when a baby is first conceived and in utero, and basically the cells divide and multiply. And at that point, some of the cells inside the womb will become bone cells, and some will become heart cells, and some will become muscle cells, and some will become neurons. And that's the first stage of the development of the nervous system, proliferation. The second stage is these neurons will then move to different sections of the brain of the nervous system. And this is called migration. And we know that migration means moving. So for instance, some neurons will move towards the front area of the brain to make up the frontal lobe, and some neurons will move to the back area of the brain to make up the occipital lobe, and so on. So migration is about movement of those neurons. Then axons of neurons will grow and start to connect physically to other neurons. and this is called circuit formation. So the formation of neural pathways, that's the first type of formation that happens, and this is still happening in the womb. So not necessarily learning, but just lining up of some basic pathways, but circuit formation will then continue outside of the womb as well. All through your life, but mainly during infancy, childhood, and again in adolescence, you have periods of circuit pruning, and this is when your body will eliminate excess neurons and synapses that haven't been used or are not needed. And the other step, the final step, is myelination, which is the process of actually growing your myelin sheath across your axon. And this starts before birth and it continues beyond adolescence, and there's still debate about what age this goes up to. So these are the 5 stages of developmental plasticity. Our brain also undergoes adaptive plasticity. So once it is fully developed, it still has the ability to change in response to learning new things. And often this will happen after brain injury to compensate for damage, but it happens just when we learn new things as well. And it basically involves rerouting and sprouting, so changing pathways, rerouting, or making new pathways, sprouting. We have 2 different types of periods in our life. So we have what we call sensitive periods, and you'll see on the next slide we have critical periods. So sensitive periods are a time in our lives where we are more sensitive to learn something. So it's best if the learning happens during this time, although it's not necessarily essential. So for instance, an example is exposure to light. It is essential that at some stage we are exposed to light, and we hope through normal natural environment that you're exposed to light pretty much from the moment you're born. And basically this is called experience expectant learning, because it's expected that you'll be exposed to light. Your body is primed to be exposed to light in the first few days of actually being born. And if you're not exposed to that light during those periods of time, you might find that there's some issues in terms of the development of the visual cortex in the brain. Experience-dependent learning can occur any time in your life, but it's still most effective at a particular time. So I'll give you another example. It's expected that you learn your natural language in the first couple of years of life. So this is called experience expectant learning. And this is the most sensitive period to actually learn your language, your natural language. And if you don't learn language in those first 2 years, and perhaps you've learnt no language till you're 10, you can still learn your natural language, but it will be a lot harder to do so. Your body's not, or your brain is not as primed at this particular time. Experience-dependent learning, again, it would be great to learn other languages at a younger age, but if you were to learn a second language later in life, this can occur at any time, so later in life, but it's most effective if you learnt it earlier. But you might not necessarily actually come across this learning, whereas this experience expectant learning, you're expected to be exposed to this throughout your natural environment. This is quite a confusing concept, and I will do my best to try and explain it a little bit more in class. There's also critical periods, which is basically a very narrow period of time when some particular learning has to take place, and if it doesn't take place then, it will never take place. And one of the critical experiments that was done in this is newborn kittens. The moment they were born, they stitched their eyes closed, and they kept them closed for 2 weeks. And then they took the stitch out and allowed the kittens to see. And what they found is that those kittens actually continued to be blind for the rest of their lives. So they realised that kittens had a critical period of 2 weeks where they had to be exposed to visual stimuli, and if they weren't, then they never regained their vision. So this is very much called a critical period because it's a narrow period of time where the learning has to occur. So it's not about ideal time, the learning must occur during this time. We as humans don't really have critical periods. Perhaps perhaps we do with vision, but clearly it's not ethical for us to do that experiment on humans. So as far as we know, we don't have critical periods. One of the most famous, I guess, critical periods and one of the easiest ones to observe is quite often birds will attach to whatever they see first within moments of their birth. And if you Google or go into YouTube and have a look at critical periods, you'll find a whole heap of YouTube videos about birds that are following around different animals because that was the first one that they saw and they think that this is now their mother. And we'll watch some of those videos in class too. That's it for this particular video. There's one more video to come before the holidays on classical conditioning. So I will see you again soon. Bye.